At 3:14 p.m. local time, the Caribbean Sea looked exactly the way any sailor would want it to look. The water was calm, visibility stretched for miles, and the wind held steady. Nothing seemed unusual. A U.S. aircraft carrier was moving through international waters on a routine transit, maintaining a constant speed and course. Flight activity was limited. No drills, no alerts, just another controlled movement through a region where the U.S. Navy had operated for decades. Then the radar picture changed. On the screens inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, 7 surface contacts appeared almost at once. They were not grouped together, and they were not scattered by chance. Each one approached from a different direction, carefully spaced, forming a broad arc along the carrier's projected path. Their speeds began to rise, slowly at first, then with clear consistency. This was not normal commercial traffic. Within seconds, watch officers started identifying the contacts. Hull shapes, radar signatures, propulsion patterns, everything pointed to Venezuelan naval vessels. Patrol ships, lightly armed on paper, but clearly moving with purpose. There were no distress calls, no radio contact, no effort to identify themselves. On the bridge, the mood stayed quiet. No panic, no raised voices, only calm confirmations as the officer of the deck acknowledged each update from CIC. Bearings, ranges, closest points of approach, everything was recorded. Every second mattered, and every decision had to stand up not only tactically, but legally. The carrier did not change course. That decision alone said a great deal. In modern naval operations, the first response often shapes everything that follows. Turning away can suggest uncertainty. Changing speed can invite miscalculation. But holding steady, maintaining discipline, forces the other side to reveal its intent. And as the minutes passed, that is exactly what the Venezuelan ships began to do. 2 of the 7 accelerated hard, pushing their engines well beyond normal cruising speed. Another adjusted course slightly, closing in on the carrier's starboard quarter. The formation was tightening, and not by accident. It was coordinated. From above, it would have looked like measured pressure applied from multiple directions, the kind of gray zone maneuver meant to intimidate without crossing into open conflict. They were counting on hesitation. What they were approaching, however, was not an isolated warship. It was a U.S. aircraft carrier. An asset designed to handle pressure, not respond emotionally to it. Every movement around it was being tracked not by one radar alone, but by layers of sensors, aircraft, and satellite coverage extending far beyond the horizon. Even so, the carrier remained quiet. No warnings were broadcast. No escorts rushed forward. The flight deck stayed calm. Sailors continued their routines with the kind of professionalism that comes only from training for moments like this. The message was understated, but unmistakable. We see you, and this changes nothing. At that stage, the Venezuelan commanders likely felt they had the initiative. 7 holes against 1, approaching from multiple angles, narrowing the distance. In many situations, that kind of posture would force some kind of response. At least a course adjustment, maybe a radio exchange. But none came. And that was when the real mistake began to take shape. Because the longer the carrier held its line, the more information it gathered. Engine noise, radar activity, maneuver patterns, command timing. Every move those 7 ships made was being recorded, time-stamped, and analyzed in real time. What looked like pressure was, in reality, exposure. This was not yet a direct confrontation. No alarms were sounding, and no weapons were being readied. But the tone had changed. The Venezuelan ships were no longer simply signaling presence. They were committing themselves to a narrative that would become harder and harder to reverse. They thought they were closing in on a symbol. What they did not realize was that they were moving into a system built to let the other side make the first mistake. Quietly, professionally, and with consequences that might not be obvious until much later. By 3:21 p.m., the geometry of the encounter was no longer theoretical. The 7 Venezuelan warships had closed in enough that every bearing change now mattered. On the carrier's tactical displays, their tracks formed a tightening pattern, no longer a distant arc, but a converging problem. Closest points of approach were recalculated in real time, shrinking with every update. Still, the carrier held steady. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere remained controlled and methodical. Radar operators called out speed changes. Electronic warfare technicians monitored emissions. Intelligence specialists compared live data against known Venezuelan naval profiles. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just disciplined observation, the kind that turns confusion into clarity. What stood out was not raw aggression, but coordination. 2 Venezuelan ships altered course within seconds of one another, matching speed as though following the same command cue. Another held back intentionally, preserving spacing. This was not random harassment. It was a planned maneuver designed to apply pressure without crossing the legal threshold that would justify a more serious response. No weapons were visibly aimed, no fire control radars were activated. That detail mattered. Under international rules of engagement, intent matters. The Venezuelan ships were careful not to do anything that would trigger an immediate escalation beyond their control. But intent is not measured by weapons alone. It is measured by movement, timing, and distance. And all three were moving in the same direction. On the bridge, the carrier's captain studied the situation in silence. There was little need for discussion. The choices were already clear. A course change might ease the tension, but it would also surrender control of the narrative. A radio warning might appear reasonable, but it would also hand the approaching ships exactly what they wanted: acknowledgement. So the carrier did neither. Instead, another set of systems came online. Quietly, long-range optics shifted toward the nearest contacts. Infrared sensors began tracking heat signatures from engines being pushed well beyond standard patrol speeds. Electronic support measures logged every radar sweep and every communication burst exchanged between the Venezuelan ships. This was escalation, but not the kind that draws headlines. From the deck, almost nothing seemed different. The sea remained calm. The carrier's wake stayed straight and unbroken. Sailors topside could now make out the distant silhouettes, gray hulls cutting across the water, growing larger minute by minute. But there was no visible tension, no running, no shouted commands. That calm was intentional. At 3:26 p.m., the nearest Venezuelan ship crossed a critical distance, a range where maneuvering space disappears quickly. At that point, even a sudden turn would not just be provocative, it would be dangerous. The risk of collision rose sharply. Any error in judgment could trigger an incident neither side truly wanted. That was when the carrier's air wing entered the picture. Not with noise, not with spectacle, with presence. A helicopter crew received a quiet tasking, not to warn, not to threaten, but to observe, to record, and to be seen just enough. Beyond the horizon, aircraft were already positioned to extend the carrier's awareness far beyond the surface picture. What the Venezuelan commanders saw as 7 ships pressing inward was, in reality, only a small part of a much larger operating space. The pressure they believed they were applying moved in one direction. The pressure around them did not. Every minute that passed without a U.S. reaction raised the stakes for the Venezuelan side. Turning away now would invite questions. Continuing forward risked crossing a line that could not easily be uncrossed. They were trapped by their own momentum, committed by the very coordination that had brought them this far. And still, the carrier did not blink. No course change, no speed adjustment, no radio call, only steady movement and silent documentation. In naval encounters, escalation often grows out of emotion, fear, pride, or simple miscalculation. But this situation was different. One side was trying to force a reaction. The other was allowing the moment to develop, fully aware that time favors discipline. By the time the Venezuelan ships realized that their presence was not shaping the encounter, but defining it, the balance had already shifted. They were no longer testing the carrier. They were revealing themselves to it. At 3:32 p.m., the encounter reached its turning point. The 7 Venezuelan warships were now close enough that their movements could be tracked visually from the carrier's bridge. Gray hulls cut through the sea on converging lines, their wakes crossing like drawn vectors on a tactical chart. Distances were no longer abstract numbers. They were now measured in minutes and in risk. This is usually the stage where such moments break one of two ways. Someone backs off, or someone raises the stakes. The U.S. aircraft carrier did neither. Instead, a new element entered the scene quietly, deliberately, and with exact precision. From the flight deck, a helicopter lifted off without drama. No theatrical launch, no sudden burst of visible activity, just a smooth rise into the air, banking low over the water before accelerating toward the nearest Venezuelan ship. Its mission was not intimidation, it was controlled visibility. Using nose-mounted sensors, the crew gained a clear view of the approaching vessels. High-resolution optics focused on bridge windows, deck crews, and navigation equipment. Infrared systems traced engine heat, confirming sustained high-speed movement. Everything was recorded, every frame was time-stamped, every maneuver was archived. Below, the Venezuelan ships noticed immediately. A helicopter changes everything. Surface ships operate on distance and momentum. Aircraft compress both. The Venezuelan commanders now understood that they were not facing a single hull, but a layered system capable of seeing, documenting, and responding far faster than anything they had deployed. Even then, the carrier remained silent. No warning lights, no radio broadcasts. The helicopter kept a measured altitude and distance, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to remain non-provocative. Its presence communicated awareness, not menace. Then came the moment that mattered most. A green laser briefly marked the forward superstructure of the lead Venezuelan ship. Not a weapon, not a targeting lock, but a precise and unmistakable signal. In the shared language of modern naval encounters, it meant only one thing. You are being watched, and nothing about this is unclear anymore. Within seconds, movement on the Venezuelan decks began to change. Sailors began to reposition. A small group gathered near the forward section quickly spread out. On the bridge, figures leaned in, binoculars up, watching the helicopter, the carrier, and the space between them. And for the first time since the encounter began, one of the 7 ships showed hesitation. Its speed eased down by a few knots. The change was slight, almost invisible to the naked eye, but on radar, it was obvious at once. Another ship shifted course by just a few degrees, enough to open up its closest point of approach. The tight pattern that had defined the maneuver started to loosen. The pressure inside the formation was beginning to fade. The helicopter stayed in its orbit, steady and unhurried. Its sensors kept working. Video fed back to the carrier in real time. What had begun as a gray zone challenge was now a fully documented event, supported by evidence that could reach far beyond the Caribbean if necessary. That was the real mistake. By committing to close proximity without the authority to take things further, the Venezuelan ships had allowed themselves to be fixed in every sense, spatially, legally, and politically. Any move closer risked crossing into unsafe navigation. Any sudden shift could be interpreted as openly hostile. Pulling back, however, would look like a failed attempt. For several tense minutes, the formation remained suspended in that narrow space between action and consequence. Then the second ship reduced speed. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough to break the rhythm. The effect was immediate. Gaps opened. Bearings began to separate. What had looked like coordinated pressure now looked more like uncertainty. The carrier never altered course. The helicopter made one final pass, its markings clearly visible. No exposed weapons, no aggressive posture, just a presence that was controlled, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. By 3:40 p.m., the outcome was no longer in question. The Venezuelan ships were still nearby, still visible, but they were no longer closing in. One by one, they widened their arcs, increasing distance under the appearance of normal navigation. No shots were fired, no shouted commands followed. Even so, the encounter was effectively over. In modern naval operations, dominance is not always about force used. Very often, it is about force deliberately withheld at exactly the right moment and for the right reasons. What the Venezuelan commanders had intended as pressure became exposure. What they had hoped would draw a reaction instead produced clarity. They had not met aggression. They had met control. By 3:45 p.m., the geometry of the encounter had changed completely. The 7 Venezuelan warships were still on radar and still visible against the flat Caribbean horizon, but the defining moment had passed. Their formation no longer suggested purpose. Speeds had settled. Courses had split apart. What began as coordinated pressure had quietly dissolved into separate navigation choices. From a distance, it may have looked as if nothing had happened. Strategically, a great deal had happened. The Venezuelan commanders made a serious miscalculation, the kind modern naval doctrine punishes without mercy. They assumed proximity would create leverage. In reality, proximity without the freedom to escalate creates vulnerability. The closer they came, the more they gave away. Engine signatures, command timing, crew reactions, decision speed. All of it was observed, recorded, and categorized, and none of it worked in their favor. On the U.S. side, the response was almost invisible to outside observers. No public warnings over open channels, no dramatic display of force, no visible posture shift that could be framed as provocation. Instead, the carrier maintained discipline and allowed the situation to define itself. That discipline denied Venezuela what it needed most: control of the narrative. Gray zone operations depend on reaction. They rely on forcing the other side into a visible choice. Turn away, raise the stakes, or explain itself. The carrier did none of those things. By holding its course and staying silent, it removed the emotional energy from the encounter. The Venezuelan ships were left applying pressure into empty space, and pressure without feedback eventually collapses. Just as importantly, the carrier never placed itself in a position where escalation became necessary. No fire control radar, no visible weapon posture, no actions that could justify a countermove. The Venezuelan commanders found themselves boxed in by their own limits. Push farther and the risk became obvious. Turn away too quickly and the message was equally obvious. Hold position and the exposure only continued. This was the point where the mistake became impossible to reverse. In modern maritime operations, evidence matters. The helicopter's recordings, optical, infrared, and positional, were not just tactical tools. They were legal and political assets. Every maneuver by the Venezuelan ships was now preserved in clear detail. If questions came later, the timeline would speak for itself. Who closed the distance? Who altered course? Who stayed steady? The carrier did not need to say a word. The data would do that for it. For Venezuela, the meaning went beyond a single encounter. Naval posturing accumulates. Every action shapes the next one. By committing 7 warships to a maneuver that produced no reaction, no concession, and no real gain, they exposed the gap between intent and capability. They showed coordination, yes, but also hesitation, presence, but not control. Meanwhile, the carrier continued on its original heading without interruption. That continuity mattered. It reinforced a basic principle of U.S. naval power. Freedom of navigation is not negotiated in real time. It is exercised calmly, repeatedly, and without unnecessary ceremony. As the distance widened, the helicopter returned to the flight deck. Systems were secured, logs were completed. What had unfolded over the previous half hour would now live on as data, reviewed, archived, and folded into future planning. No medals, no dramatic headlines, just a clear lesson. The Venezuelan ships had tried to project influence through numbers and proximity. They underestimated the value of restraint. They misread the environment they were operating in, one where visibility favors the prepared and where silence can be more decisive than force. They did not run into resistance. They ran into inevitability. And in doing so, they learned the difference between moving toward a target and testing a system built to let others reveal their own mistakes, one quiet decision at a time. By 4:10 p.m., the Caribbean had returned to the calm it had shown earlier. The Venezuelan warships were still present on radar, but now at comfortable distances, moving on separate headings that carried no pressure and no immediate risk. The U.S. aircraft carrier continued its transit exactly as planned. Same speed, same course, same mission. To an outside observer, the entire episode might have seemed uneventful. That was the point. Nothing happened because the system worked. At sea, the most dangerous moments are often the quiet ones, when pride, miscalculation, or impatience can turn proximity into disaster. What prevented that outcome here was not simply superior strength, but superior control. The carrier never needed to display its full capability because that capability was never in doubt. Every stage of the encounter reinforced that fact. The Venezuelan ships approached with numbers, coordination, and intent. But intent alone does not create leverage. Without the freedom to escalate, without legal cover, and without control of the story, pressure becomes self-defeating. Every minute they stayed close only increased their exposure to observation, documentation, and future scrutiny. For the U.S. Navy, restraint was not weakness. It was a deliberate operational decision backed by decades of doctrine, training, and experience. The carrier's crew understood that an emotional response would only hand the initiative to the other side. Instead, they allowed time, geometry, and professionalism to do the work. That discipline extended far beyond the bridge. The data gathered during the encounter, radar tracks, infrared imagery, maneuver logs, was already being processed by analysts. Patterns would be measured against earlier Venezuelan naval behavior. Command timing would be studied. Crew reactions would be assessed. Information like that does not usually make headlines, but it shapes future decisions in far more meaningful ways. Encounters like this do not end when ships separate. They carry forward. For Venezuela, the message was quiet, but unmistakable. Approaching a U.S. aircraft carrier without the intent or authority to go further does not force a response. It invites analysis, it creates documentation, and it narrows future options. The cost of the maneuver was not immediate humiliation or open confrontation. It was predictability, and predictability favors the side that collects the data. The encounter also reaffirmed a central principle. Freedom of navigation does not require constant displays of force. It requires consistency. The carrier's uninterrupted transit reinforced international norms without a threat and without a shot. That balance matters. In a world where naval encounters are becoming more frequent and more politicized, the margin for error is thin. Every close approach carries the risk of misunderstanding. Every aggressive maneuver carries the risk of setting off a chain of decisions that cannot easily be undone. The ability to prevent escalation, to let a confrontation dissolve without spectacle, is not passive. It is a skill. It is also a form of power. As the carrier moved beyond the last radar contact, the event was closed out in the official logs. No emergency traffic, no major incident declaration, just a detailed record of what happened and how it was handled. 7 warships had attempted to apply pressure. One carrier simply kept moving. That outcome was not accidental. It was the product of a system designed to absorb challenge without reacting impulsively, to control the environment without needing to dominate the headlines. So the real lesson from that afternoon in the Caribbean is not about who turned away first. It is about who never had to. Because in modern naval power, the side that remains calm, stays within the law, and holds its course usually wins long before anyone makes a more dangerous move. And sometimes the clearest victory at sea is the one that, from a distance, looks like nothing happened at all.